Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Estamos aqui em mais uma sessão das aulas abertas que este ano se dedicam ao tema de conhecer através do som. Na semana passada tivemos Salome Vogelin, em que a centralidade do som nos processos de conhecimento foi questionada e, portanto, hoje teremos mais uma sessão com a artista, designer e performer Amina Abbas-Nazari, que nos irá falar de design de ficção. Como estas sessões decorrem todas em inglês, portanto, eu vou passar a fazer a introdução da Amina em inglês. Amina holds a MA in Design Interactions from the Royal College of Art, London, and creates work within the realms of speculative design, critical design, and design fiction. She is also a trained singer. These two worlds have collided within the PhD she's currently undertaking, also at the RCA, in the School of Communication. She's also doing a PhD studentship, NPIF-funded PhD studentship in the areas of artificial intelligence and voice in partnership with IBM. She's currently a research fellow at Royal College of Art, working on the EPSRC-funded Citizen Nature Wash project. She's also a member of Mozart Choir, a research and event platform that explores the relationship between architecture and sound. Amina's work is concerned with practice-led research that can be applied to thinking around emerging technologies, in particular describing what sound might have to offer to design disciplines through fictional methodologies. In this talk, she will give examples of how it is possible to elevate sound to a primary medium within design practice. Her project's current focus is looking at utilizing sonic qualities of voice as a material for research and design practices to critically investigate the context of AI-enabled machine listening, while also speculating on possible poetic encounters with the technology. Given the rapidly increasing capabilities of machine listening and growing use of the voice as a key mode of human-computer interaction, this project assumes a particular relevance and urgency, and that's why it's so important to have Amina with us today. Amina uses experimental and extended vocal practice as a method to investigate vocal potential and its use as a material of imagining, embodying and prototyping design ideas. Sonic qualities of voice are explored through how they are shaped by bodily, environmental and digital architecture in an intertwined investigation of the sonic sphere of human experience, intelligence and knowing. These perspectives are a critical alternative to the traditional use of sound in the field of design as an accompaniment to visual-based interactions or to amplify user experience. Amina, thank you so much to be with us today. The stage is yours, and we are very excited to listen to your presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's so wonderful to be part of this innovative knowing through sound. It's a shame that I can't and we can't all be together in person, but it's still it's lovely to meet you all, and thank you for coming. Thank you for the invite. So I've titled this talk Phonocentric in Design Fiction. The design fiction element I will come on to later, but I will tell you a little bit about this idea of phonocentricism. And it's the idea that sound and voice are sort of superior to other modes of communication. It particularly challenges the idea of communicating ideas through words. It says that actually words, the written language, is the derivative of speech and of voice. And while this isn't really a sort of position that I particularly hold or very particularly highly, I chose this word for this talk because, as you will see through my projects, they really sort of highlight voice and sound and speech as a primary medium within my design practice. And I think this is particularly interesting because, you know, design is still fundamentally very visually orientated, very sort of oculocentric way of communicating ideas. So what does it mean to kind of further integrate the voice and sound and speech into design? I kind of sound within art has become quite well integrated and has quite a sort of lineage to it. But sound within design, those two things, those two elements are not necessarily. There's potential. There's room for them, room for it to grow, and I think that's what I try to address in some of my work. So, as João mentioned in the intro so nicely gave me, I'm currently studying for a PhD in the School of Communication at the Royal College of Art. And yes, the means of this are artificial intelligence and voice. And this presentation will touch on some of the PhD process, but actually it will show sort of a lineage of how I came to be studying these things as a PhD, because the voice design is something that I've been exploring for quite a while now, and it's become more and more prominent, especially as these kind of technologies such as Alexa and interacting with our voice with technology has become more of a almost like an everyday thing now. So yeah, this talk will very much be a sort of artist talk that describes my art practice, both as a designer, researcher, and a performer. So firstly, let me tell you a little bit about my background, because I think that will help in understanding my practice and where I come from and why all these sort of ideas being pulled together in the PhD. So I previously studied an MA called Design Interactions, also at the Royal College of Art. And it was a course initiated by Anthony Dunn and his partner Fiona Raby. And it was a course that existed around 10 years and disbanded in, I think it was around sort of 2015. And although a lot of that are still very much prominent within sort of art and design practice, the course itself doesn't exist anymore. They were kind of pioneers of this idea that actually design doesn't have to solve a problem. Design doesn't have to make things streamlined, more user-friendly, which is sort of traditionally what design would seek to address. They were interested in how do we use them as a medium to communicate ideas, particularly about emerging technology and emerging science. Yeah, they're very much thinking about using design as a medium to tell stories. And these stories might necessarily be about today, the here and the present. They might be kind of set in a future scenario. And a lot of the projects often touch on the social, political, and ethical implications of emerging technology and emerging science, and try to present alternative perspectives for the way we sort of ideas that aren't particularly sort of mainstream uses of technology. So actually, there's this diagram by one of the alumni students of the course, which I think helps to sort of explain quite well where design interactions, where design fiction might sit. And design fiction is sort of a cluster of terms which are sort of interchangeable, although have slight differences to them. So you can see in this bubble in the middle, we have speculative design, design fiction, critical design. Those three are kind of very closely related and quite often interchangeable in their use. But you can also see how this idea of design fiction sort of sits between art and design. Art where perhaps there's not too many constraints, and design where it's more strategy and fitting a brief. I'm particularly drawn to the term design fiction, because I think it makes the most sense in a way, because it's quite easy to compare it to science fiction. So you can imagine design fiction like science fiction, but instead of using the medium of words and literature, we use the medium of design to tell stories of alternative societies and alternative uses of technology. This is also another tool which is quite often used in speculative design fiction, called the futures cone. And it's sort of a way to think through where these speculative scenarios might sit. So if you imagine this, where the apex of the cone is, that's sort of present time, that's here and today. But the further into the future, more possibilities open up for the way we use technology, or scientific advances, for example. And, you can different people choose to present their work in different ways. Some people might be working more in a sort of probable futures. Other people might be verging more on the impossible, which he kind of considered the extremes of science fiction, a bit more sort of like fantasy in a way. But for me, I'm kind of quite aligned to this idea by the science fiction writer Samuel R. Delany. He says science fiction is not a prediction of the future, but a distortion of the present. So a lot of my projects are they're familiar, but they're sort of slightly skewed in their ideas, to just sort of get people to question, actually, why do we use technology in this way? Or how could we use it slightly different? What does that mean for our lives and the way we live, and ideas like that. So alongside my design practice, as João said, I'm also a singer, and I've just been singing since a sort of very young child, mostly in choirs, and this is how I sort of gained my music and singing education, quite informally through generally singing in choirs. But most recently I sing with a choir called Muzak, which started as a research project about sound and space at London Metropolitan University. And I guess that was probably about, 10, 12 years ago now, but now it's quite an established choir, and we sort of travel throughout and sing in different festivals. And alongside the very traditional sort of choral music we sing, we also quite often were artists and take part in artist projects, and they get us to do lots of sort of weird and wonderful things with our voices, and we much think about performance, the way we're arranged in space, how we engage with architecture. The piece performed in Belgium, it's called Gestalt Minimal, by a composer and percussionist, Greta Ekot. I can show you, or I will show you, a short video about Muzak, so you get a bit more of a sort of sense of us.
I know, I'm coming.
Can you greet his left hand?
Yeah, so more recently, I guess, in the last 5 years or so, I've also been performing as a soloist for different artist projects. Up until a few years ago, I only performed in choirs, and I'm not sure what happened. I started singing on my own, which was quite an unusual experience at first. But actually, it's really allowed me the opportunity to really explore my voice and the different ways of using my voice, and almost like using the extremes of my voice. So the sculptor, artist Marguerite Humeau asked me to perform one of these Venus sculptures that were displayed in a solo exhibition she had in Hamburg. And I'll tell you about this project actually because it's fascinating. So she was studying the origins of these Venus figures, these prehistoric female goddess statues which are found throughout the world. And her research expanded on the idea that perhaps they were sort of not female goddesses at all, depictions of females, but perhaps these little figurines are actually kind of suggesting formations of animal brains, which apparently prehistoric people ingested for their psychoactive properties. So in this, Venus figures functioned as recipes, making an anatomical guide for shamans and those seeking spiritual ecstasy through altered consciousness. And yeah, it was amazing kind of producing vocal sounds for her, and actually led me to kind of the extremes of my voice, where at one point I was sort of nearly clean, was perhaps a bit much. And then I've worked probably for the last 4 years now with this amazing Greek who's based in London called Fanny Pirelli. She quite often gives me a script which she's written and then asks me to interpret those words, and I kind of use a process of colouring the words with my voice, but sometimes she plays me old Greek songs and wants me to kind of imitate the kind of vocalizations and sound world that's created in those songs. And then after she's recorded my voice, she then works with these performers who lip sync the voicings that I've created. So you get this very odd experience where, well, for me, it's also very odd because I hear my voice, but coming from another body, which is kind of a very unusual experience. But it also creates this very ethereal, magical world, and her performers, her characters are very much sort of half human, half animal, very sort of mythical. I'll play you a clip of her. It's really brilliant, and it's an amazing experience working with her. Pebbles and eggs laid together in the den of a big spirit, warmer than lava. The plaster parts are bigger, even more, integrating forever into the land, only to be raised again. Lullabies carried by the stream to sing of the ships. The nests are turning, listen to the sounds from the rest. A black-throated loon is carrying the shadows of Jupiter in its throat.
two moons of the planet are vast and melting icebergs, driven by kinetic energy. They create warmth, and the temperate water comes and settles. It is gentle sport.
Yeah, so this kind of leads me on to my own, and I hope with this sort of background information it will sort of make sense of help to make sense of my work, I guess. So the project I want to talk about is called If Objects Could Speak. And actually this project was created way back during my undergrad. So this was sort of around 2009. And I became interested in this technology called radio frequency identification, or RFID. And you might have heard of this kind of very simple, low-tech, cheap technology because it's quite often found in like ID cards or the stickers, the security stickers they put inside library books so you can't steal them. But these little chips, you can basically attach them to any object, and it allows that object to be recognized by a receiver. And for this project, I wanted people to be able to tell stories about the objects that they owned, because I was thinking, well, if one could speak, actually, what would they say? And I thought, they would probably tell the stories of their owners and who's owned them. So you could sort of imagine that perhaps a family heirloom is passed down through the generations of a family, and it contains voices of the people that have owned it. So this device I created is sort of a recorder and a receiver that when you position it near an object, it will recall those oral histories that are in it. And this speculative device would allow us different ways of telling stories and cataloguing information about our family history and ourselves to live on after we die in the age of the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is quite ironic, really, because, in 2009, it was being talked as like this emerging technology that's going to change our lives along with sort of smart objects. But, we're now 2021 and the Internet of Things is still an emerging technology that's going to change our lives. So that didn't really come to fruition, but what has changed in that time is actually we do have devices like Google Home and Alexa in the home which we communicate with. So, perhaps I was seeing the future a little bit, but this is kind of where it started, where I started to think about voice and technology and how could that change the interactions we have things around us. For me now, I've not changed direction, but I've become very much more interested in the sonic qualities of speech, the sounds of speech, as opposed to its linguistic content. Because as a singer and a performer, I find myself comparing speech to song. And actually, for me, speech has a musicality to it that exists outside and beyond music. And I think this is particularly apparent if you think about listening to people speak and you don't understand the language that they're speaking. You know, some dialects and some languages have very musical aspects to them. But yeah, we don't often think this kind of musicality or this sonic content to speech when we're talking, because the idea of talking is that you're trying to communicate ideas in the most direct way, not about using your voice in the most sort of beautiful way. But this chart sort of describes how words, how speech have a musicality. So you can do this all now home in your heads. If you say each of these words on one tone, actually they produce a scale. So key is very high voice, whereas cool is much lower in the voice. And if you say them in order, you'll basically go down a scale, and then starting at the bottom, going up, you'll go up a scale. And that's sort of, if you know anything about sort of harmonics or overtones, this is what sort of defines the difference between these vowel sounds when they're produced in the mouth. So yeah, I became very interested in these sonic qualities of speech, and this was a text score that I produced using different vowel phonetics. And I was sort of interested in how you could sort of use sounds to disorientate a performer in a space between speech and sound. You know, where do vocal things lose and gain semantic meaning? Where can they potentially take on new alternative meanings? With an idea that, how can we sort of expand the way we use our voices in speaking? So this sort of leads me on to another project called Across the Sonic Border, Variations on Fifth Hertz. I'm not sure if you're aware of this phenomenon, I guess you could call it, but electrical network frequency analysis is sometimes used in forensics to identify when recordings were made. So in any urban space, especially inside spaces, there is this constant hum, which we're not really aware of because it's inbound, and it's on and around 50 hertz if you live in the UK, or 60 hertz if you live in America. But it continuously sort of fluctuates on and around 50 hertz. So it's never quite the same from second to second or day to day. So if you take a recording inside space and you are able to access the data from the electrical grid, you can actually pinpoint the time of recording almost to the precise second. The issue is that the electrical grid information, I don't think, is particularly widely available, other than to like police and different authorities. But this technology does exist, and I found it sort of fascinating. And so I started to think about this, and also the idea of speech and voice recognition for this particular project. So this speculative design piece concerns speech and voice recognition. In Mario, the UK has started to use speech analysis as a key assessment for gaining access to the country. And actually, I write speculative that this is a practice that already happens in some countries for undocumented asylum seekers. If they can't ascertain where they're from, they will use voice analysis to determine or, decide where they're from for them, essentially. In addition, electrical network frequencies, as I described before, is used in law, forensics, and other aspects of culture to mark or conceptualize time because of its ability to timestamp recording. People have become hyper-aware of its hum. So, yeah, in this scenario, English is still the fundamental language, but people have formed their own speech communities, creating sonic borders and allowing them distinct ways of life. People have diversified their language in terms of the words they use, but in terms of sound, due to the tone on and around 50 hertz, which is actually a sort of G sharp of the pervasive hum. So it was presented as 8 audio clips that could be listened to by inputting a headphone jack into a cut map, and they could be listened to independently, but also provided a linear narrative and a chronological narrative that started at the Dover border as like a key entry point to the UK. In scene 1, the hum is the loudest and most potent, and it gradually gets through the scenes and has less influence on the people, finally ending in scene 8, where there is no hum. I should have an audio clip.
We are gathered to discuss the motion put forward by our esteemed colleague to send a team of sanctioned speech therapists across the sonic border. This undercover initiative will lead to the covert influencing of key individuals who have expressed a desire or interest in joining our district. Recorded accompanied by the official electrical frequency timestamp, you may proceed.
So yeah, in that clip, perhaps it wasn't obvious because you don't hear all the clips, but that was an example of one of these particular speech commutes. And in this scene is kind of the equivalent of like a parliament setting, but instead of using words to debate ideas, they use sounds to challenge each viewpoints. And essentially they sort of battle it out through singing. And they keep going until they find a resolve. Thinking about how ideas can be expressed through sound without using words. For this project, it was sort of important to me to work with non-professional singers and everyday people, because it was a way for me to bring people into this narrative, into this speculative scenario, and actually allow them to think some of the challenges of voice recognition and speech recognition, and perhaps what implications that has on different groups of people. You can listen to the rest of the audio clips on my website if you want. So moving on to another project. This particular project is called Acoustic Ecology of a System. And I'm for this project, I was sort of very interested in the sounding of synthesized voices. So AI-enabled synthesized voices are designed to be conceptualized as anthropomorphic, with human-sounding voices, and given recognizably human names, like which are female-like in gender. However, we know nothing of this being, where she is from, what her interests, beliefs, or ideologies. The acousmatic nature of synthesized voices means they are free to operate, not bound to any particular culture or philosophy, etc., but are also added to the physical world in terms of space and time, which human voices act within. Insight into what lies beneath AI's sleek, shiny surface was beautifully and duly documented as part of Anatomy of an AI System by Kate Crawford and Vladan Jola, shown in this diagram. I know it's tiny, really can't see what's going on, so I would really recommend you to look at the project online, but what it sort of shows is the sheer scale, what involves interacting with an Alexa. So like on the left-hand side is the manufacturing processes, in the middle is the data and processing, and on the right is sort of how supposedly they're supposed to be disposed of. Crawford says each small moment of convenience, be it answering a question, turning on a light, or playing a song, requires a vast planetary network fueled by the extraction of non-renewable materials, labour, and data. And I don't know if you can see it again because it's tiny, but each of these pink little dots highlighted on the diagram is actually where a human is, where humans are enacting something. And what you begin to realize very quickly by looking at this diagram is that artificial intelligence is actually not that artificial after all. It's sort of performing lots of different tasks, but obviously they go unrecognized, and they have to work in precarious conditions, and yeah. So there's a lot of debate around these things, and particularly in the sort of female gendering of synthesized voices. But for this particular project, I kind of wanted to sidestep a lot of those debates and look at it from a slightly different perspective and see actually what sound could have to offer. So a current work in progress I'm developing creates fictional acoustics for these synthesized voices to explore how sound could be used to locate non-human voices, space, time, and environment, and architecture to imagine alternative narratives about the technology with which we now so intimately interact. You know, potentially this is a means to navigate and conceptualize and critique the unseen networks of AI systems using acute sound design to add a sense of the material world that fundamentally underpins these digital systems. I'll play you a clip in a moment, but I used clips of what's called...
Okay.
Oh,
Betyder till typ, nej, asverkligen.
you can listen to
Sid
this
sounds
now.
guys.
Sorry, did you say?
Go on, bro. Yeah, as the hitching we've going to, if this was a pan.
So I don't know if you got that, but if you go to that website, Research and Waves, the plan, you can actually sort of navigate it on your own, interacting with it yourself. But I use clips of Babel, which is produced by Google WaveNet, and I found this idea of Babel really interesting. And it's when they're training AI, well, in WaveNet anyway, they train it with the sound of speech, first of all. So it makes these things that sound like speech, but actually it's absolute nonsense. And it's because it's a two-part process. They train WaveNet what speech sounds like, and then they train WaveNet actually just to make a sentence. But in between, there's this potential to make these things that sound like speech, but it's not speech at all.
It just isn't. There'll be
I don't want
sense.
to play it again.
There's lots of episodes if you tell me bazı neyin kadar Jeffrey Terry Tony to the Sonata that
This was the clip I actually wanted to play. So it's a small clip of what you experience if you go on the web. You can kind of move through this dark space. I wanted it to be black because the idea would be that you wear headphones and you kind of experience these different architectures, different spaces, but through the sounding of the voices in these with these effects applied.
just types.
Another project is called What You Will Watch and Hear. I was inspired by a text by Timothy Morton and his ideas around horror objects. And this was a piece written and performed by Muzak Choir, who I talked about earlier. I'll read you the text. It's from a short video you can find on YouTube. He says, oh, and I should point out that on the screen you just see some bamboo sort of in the wind. But he says, he narrates it. He says, what you will watch and hear is the wind in the bamboo. What you will watch and hear are the bamboo stems clicking one another. What you will watch and hear is a QuickTime movie which samples visual images and sound at a certain rate, translating them into more or less perforated versions of themselves. What you will watch and hear is my hand moving slightly as the muscles in my right forearm fail to maintain stillness. What you will watch and hear are photons from the sun reflecting from quantum chloroplasts that make the bamboo green. What you will watch and hear are chloroplasts, bacteria hiding from the environmental cataclysm they created, the cataclysm called oxygen, 1.5 billion years ago. So, really like poetic narration of a very sort of simple event. And if you read more about hyper objects, it will. But for me, I was just sort of fascinated about this idea of an event and viewing it from many different perspectives. This particular piece considers how phenomena such as global warming is so complex and massively distributed across space and time, it's beyond the grasp and understanding of the individual. And I think also today we live in a society of rituals, and Zygmunt Bauman writes a bit more about this, and I think this sort of compromises our ability to comprehend the reality of living as actors within complex networks. But perhaps by employing collective sounding and listening, meditate on how to interpret and understand these types of events. So, for me, one of the reasons why I love singing in a choir is almost because you have to suspend this idea of yourself as an individual. You have to really, you have to think of yourself as a group, as a collective, because a choir is one voice. It's not many voices, it's one voice together. So for the piece, the choir and the audience come together to perform different constituent parts of the whole, much as a choir does, each performing and embodying a different perspective on which to watch and hear the same event. What you will watch and hear is the unfolding interplay and imprinting of cause and effect, where the sum total of all the events inscribing themselves on each other forms a history. And to describe a little bit about how the performance was sort of arranged, there's this diagram. So the total number of participants would be divided into 6 groups, and those 6 groups each formed concentric circles, and each of the groups performed like very simple actions, but it was about their sort of accumulative actions contributing to one event, I guess. And so you get a sense of the overall shape of the piece. It was like a thunderstorm coming. So it started off very small with very small, subtle movements and sounds, which then gradually grew and became very accentuated into this full-blown thunderstorm, and then it just stops, basically. The final sort of 2 interconnected projects that I'll talk about, speculative listening, are more on listening really, as opposed to performing and sounding. But for me, these 2 things are intertwined, and actually you can't really separate them. So this particular workshop was facilitated at the Tate Modern for teachers and museum work. I run a few iterations of the workshop, one of which was for families. I didn't know families were going to arrive. All these 4-year-olds arrived, and I was a bit like, oh God, how do I communicate what we're supposed to do to 4-year-olds? But actually they loved it, and they got rid of it and were kind of much more free than the adults in a way. But this project is very big, but it does concern machine listening and its growing capabilities to deduce information about humans, and its growing ability to sort of interpret sonic information about our lives. So during this workshop, we were interested, or I asked people to explore ideas around, how do you want to be heard by technology? How can technology allow us to be heard and listen in different ways? How does what we hear shape the way we understand the world and each other? But there's a limit to what we can hear with our human ears, but technology allows us to hear things that we just can't. And a sort of simple way to think about this is, they're too far away, they're too high pitched, they're too low pitched, they're sounds that occur too slowly, they might just be too quiet, they're sounds that are hidden. But we can use technology to listen to these things. So I asked people, what if you could listen to anything, listen to. So in this creative hands-on workshop, we speculatively imagined how to combine our bodies with technology, and how that might allow us new or modified ways to be heard, communicate with each other, and listen to the world. For the workshop, I produced a soundtrack, inaudible audio, so sounds that you can only hear with the use of technology. And this was kind of a way to inspire people in their making ideas. And as part of this, I made an AI clone of my voice, which you can actually do on the internet. I think we can hear.
This is the sound of corn brewing.
I love the sound of corn growing because you can hear it as it just happens too slowly. Like it's too slow to notice it. So in that recording, they record a field, but then they speed it up, and suddenly we can become aware of the sound of corn growing. If you want to know what that sounds like. So yeah, people in the workshop use these like silent disco headphones, and it created this very intimate listening experience where they could only hear this soundtrack while they made things. And actually we could only speak to each other, or only one person speak at a time, because you needed the microphone in order to be heard by the participants. And actually it was a really nice way to explore listening and get a very focused listening experience as part of the workshop. And I think it kind of added something to the way people participated. But the results of the workshop, I mean, people explored the multisensory nature of listening. For example, this person wanted to hear deep underground sounds, but they wanted to pursue their hips as opposed to like being focused on the ears. And one lady was interested in what the sound of combustion sounds like. What does it sound like when the sperm meets the egg? And she was a teacher in a primary school, and she thought perhaps this is a way to really age children in the idea of like reproduction. So I think something I sort of really value about work people or I really kind of am interested in is that if you move people into an imaginative space and you give them the freedom and the kind of empowerment to really believe in their own ideas, they actually come up with like really fascinating things, which as a designer, I don't think I even would come up with, and then when you compare that to the way corporations work or working as a designer within a company, you're given a brief and you're given a budget and you have to meet all these requirements. But what happens is we keep just essentially reproducing the same technology again and again that actually doesn't really sort of speak to people's needs and wants. It's quite it's all about making money, doing things, isn't it? But when you start to think more freely about technology, the possibilities are endless and actually really inspiring and imaginative. So the final thing I want to talk about is actually connected to the previous. I was asked to do that workshop, but online in the lockdown, and I just couldn't really bring myself to do an online workshop. So I sort of transformed that project into this interactive telephone experience, and a slightly new name called Multiphonic Connections. So it was a project that existed between the 18th and 21st of June 2020, and was commissioned by Empathy Loading, an online project exploring aesthetic relations between humans and networked non-humans. And the project was developed by students from MA Curating Contemporary Art program, the graduates from that program at the Royal College of Art in partnership with Furtherfield, which is a gallery in London, as part of their Love Summer program. So unfortunately, it doesn't work anymore if you ring the number. But if you did ring the number between those particular dates, on dialing the number, callers were greeted with different listening options. So on the telephone, it would say, "Thank you for calling Multiphonic Connections. We make the inaudible audio. 0 for your initial listening calibration exercise. Press 1 for sounds from inside the human body. Press 2 for far orgasmic sounds. 3 for sounds from deep below you. 4 for sounds made by animals. 5 for sounds that manifest very slowly. 6 for sounds that happen extremely fast. 7 for very quiet sounds. Press star at any time to return to this menu, and not at any time to leave a voicemail message. So these are images of some of the voicemail messages that I received. And again, people came up with these beautiful poetic ideas of sounds that they'd like to be able to hear, but that we can't currently. And it was the same soundtrack that I used in the workshops previously about these in-audio sounds. But yeah, instead of asking people to make something with their hands to describe a device where they could potentially use things, I just asked them to leave a message. And that's the end.
Thank you very much, Amina. It was a fascinating presentation. It really makes us question the physicality and the place of voice, and in particular in our time. It's particularly interesting to think about that in our time, as you mentioned. We are now going for a short break before we start the Q&A. So I think we have about 5 minutes, and I ask everyone to come back in that short, after those short 5 minutes, and to think about questions for Amina, and see you in a minute, in 5 minutes. Hi again. We are back to have a conversation with Amina, and I don't know if yes, we have already a question. Vasco Barbedo, can we listen to his question? Vasco, I think you can speak now, but I think you have your microphone is muted. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Good evening. And you told about the choir as just one voice, and I thought immediately of Stockhausen and his work. He has an album that is only music with voices. So I think he was the first person to think the voice as a sound, not only to sing, but as a sound, as an acoustic element. So I would like to ask you if he is an influence for you and how he inspired in your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yes, actually, this was probably around the same time actually that I started thinking about these sonic qualities of voice. Was when I formed Stockhausen's Stimmung, I think it's called, and it's this series of I think he called modals, and he has a particular way of notating that encourages the harmonics of the voice to out, as opposed to the fundamental note that you're actually singing. It's a whole piece and actually goes on for hours. I haven't sung all of it, only elements of it, that are all based around the harmonics of the voice and the overtones. And I guess this was when I started to think more about the different layers of sound within singing, and then subsequently within speech. And yeah, it was performing this piece in the choir, I guess. I don't know, I'm just obsessed with choirs, which is perhaps quite an unusual thing to be obsessed with. Just love the experience of being together and thinking, actually, how do we all work together to produce this one? Sometimes you have to really neglect. Sometimes you just really want to sing really loud and really big and bold, but you can't, you have to think about this overture that you are creating with the sound and with the voices, and at some points some are, and it's also very much intertwining, this very intrinsic relationship between sounding and listening. The only way to be able to perceive this overall one voice experience is to be constantly listening to the acoustic that you're in, the space that you're in, but also all the people around you. And yeah, I just find it sort of magical in a way.
We have now another question. Can we listen to the next question?
Hello, Amina. How are you? Thank you for your talk, and hello, João. Thank you for your beautiful moderation. So, Amina, we've talked previously, and I think we have been dwelling in neighboring fields. I think so. So, I would like to get your opinion on what I think to be at least two different approaches to voice modeling in technology. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, just about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think you mentioned the voder at the beginning of your talk, right? And the voder's mechanism, like Campellan's speech machine and Reach's talking machine, is based on physical modeling of voice. Well, like the mechanisms include synthetic throats, lungs, mouths, etc. On the other hand, computational vocal synthesis seems to focus on speech, like speech as a subset of voice. and their inner proceedings are already focused primarily in linguistics and phonetics. I think that WaveNet would be an exception of such dichotomy. So would you make a distinction between these two modes of approaches and the mode of embodiment that they entail? Do they still profess an outdated Cartesian dualism between mind and body? Yeah, I wanted to pick your brain on this one. Thank you.
Okay, I think I grasped most of your question, and I'm not entirely sure how to answer it, because yeah, there are different ways of synthesizing, and I guess for me one of the most interesting things, and the reason why I put the picture of the Voda was actually this is I just find the Voda again fascinating. But a lot of speech synthesis today still goes back to these very ideas of the Voda, which was invented in 1939 and shown at the World's Fair. They still kind of originate in this Voda that was produced by Bell Labs, and yeah, a lot of speech synthesis today still relies on this speech-to-text process, or this text-to-speech process. You have to convert the speech into text before it's usable by, for example, an AI. So for me, that's kind of interesting, thinking about, yeah, a lot of how all the sort of sonic qualities get missed in that aspect of the interaction. But actually, when I first started reading about the Voda, and there's some amazing recordings from the original Voda, I think you can find them on YouTube. What's really struck by was, yeah, that speech is kind of, I know it's obvious, but I hadn't really thought about it in this way before, that speech is composed of these different units of sound, and the Voda assembles them into kind of sense and substance so that we can be able to receive information from that. But another project that I didn't show is about kind of, yeah, breaking speech down into these kind of sound segments, and then kind of seeing how many different combinations you can put that into. Because I'm always interested in, like, how do we sort of expand language, expand the voice? And so, yeah, for me, seeing and understanding how it works with this stream of air, and then seeing this person at this sort of keyboard like device literally play the synthesized voice, almost again brought me back to music, thinking about, okay, well, a piano, she's playing, it was like a sort of piano like device. And the idea with a piano is that you try to make the most, you know, beautiful, experimental, or, you know, it's a creative device, whereas the Voda was trying to replicate speech. So it just made me think, okay, how can you sort of think about it a bit more like a musical instrument? Again, going back to this idea about speech having a tonality, especially when you take away the semantics or put them back in, or I'm not sure that answers your question exactly, but that's the things that it made me think about.
It's another. Thank you for input. Sure. Thank you very much. I think we'll be able to talk about this in the near future. So, but thank you for your perspective. Really, thank you.
We have another question from Francisco. Can we?
Hello, Amina. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
I was interested in the sound of corn growing, and I'm just wondering if you can explain a little bit more in detail, what does the process involve? It's just like a time lapse of sound, or is it more complex?
As far as I know, it's just a sped up recording. So another thing to think about with these inaudible audios or things that we can only hear with the use of technology is that they require an amount of processing so that we can hear the frequencies, essentially. So a lot of the underground sounds, or even cosmic sounds, sounds from space, are just not in the frequencies that humans can hear. So part of this technological listening involves quite a lot of processing to convert them to frequencies and waveforms that humans would be able to perceive. And yeah, as far as I know, with the corn growing one, it's simply a matter of time, speeding up the timeline, because it just happens over a sort of too long a period of time. Yeah.
Oof, the background noise.
The background noise is my cat trying to come in the room, making an appearance.
Thank you.
Maybe I should can you give me 2 minutes? I will let her in, because I think yes.
Thank you, Francisco, for your question.
So naughty.
We don't. Amina, I have a question of my own. And I wrote it down to make sure that it comes. I found your work very interesting, and your essay on AI voices very interesting. And my question is if you think that the fake neutrality of these AI voices and its lack of poetic, material, spatial qualities, while still trying to resemble to be real, while still to resemble to be human, if you think that this lack of characteristics affects our criticality and our possibility to picture alternative futures, and this relates also to the cone that you showed, the cone of futures.
Precisely. So I guess there's a few things that sort of influence my idea with these prospective futures, and there's almost too many things to talk about. So, I mean, I guess one way to think about it is that the voice is always evolving, and it's quite easy to think of it as something fixed, but it's really not at all. And that becomes very apparent as a singer and as a performer when I use my voice in unusual ways. But, you know, even if you listen to people speaking from the 1930s, for example, the way they speak and the way they use their mouth and all the apparatus in your body you need to be able to talk, the kind of sounding, the accents and the dialects of their voice are quite different to how we speak now. So for me, like, speaking and voicing is like this, well, not just for me, speaking and voicing is a sort of evolutionary process. But obviously now we are interacting with technology using our voices. How is that going to change the course of perhaps just this natural action? And I worry, again, because I just sort of do generally worry a bit about technology. I worry that it will almost like reduce the way we use our voices and sort of squash the way we use our voices, and or restrict them. So, for example, I haven't gone into much of this today, but a lot of voice technologists still have trouble understanding particular accents and dialects and particular languages. Like, these technologies are far more accessible to white English-speaking people than they are to others, for example. So what does that mean for people who can't interact with this using this technology? Will they be forced, or there are already examples of people sort of being forced to change the way they speak for Alexa to understand them? So then when you extrapolate this on a much bigger scale, the worry is that actually we lose a lot of the diversity of language, because if these devices become ubiquitous and they are becoming more pervasive, in order to sort of just live our everyday lives, that might mean restricting the way we use our voice. So for me, I tried to tell a slightly different story of actually how can you I do have a project that it's kind of in the makings and not ready to be shown yet, but how can you kind of trick the AI, or how can you interact with an AI system, but actually where this kind of diversity of voice is celebrated or even like encouraged, to expand the way we use our voices. So I guess that, a few elements that are relevant to your question, but there's lots to talk about.
Thank you very much. I mean, indeed, it's very interesting to understand this question, and it's almost like another step on the normatization of language that we've been going through, and normatization, and also kind of homogenization of different languages and different dialects. It's very inspiring to see your talk and your work. Thank you very much for being here with us. I think we have no more questions. So I think we will wrap up. Não temos nenhum. Okay. I think we will wrap up this talk. Amina, thank you very much for your presence with us here, and next week we will have Claudia Martinho. We will talk about the connections between architecture and sound, and I believe we will continue this process of learning about the potential of sound as a tool and a material of knowledge, as we learned today with Amina. Amina, thank you so much. And
for having me as well. Thank you for your questions as well.
Thank you very much, and see you next week at the same time on the same web links.